Hello, welcome to another episode of Namtaro Talks. As promised, this episode will be of a lighter topic, a bit more fun topic as compared to the previous episodes. It will be about comic strips. Yeah, like the Sunday Funnies, like the section in the Sunday paper back in the day. Nowadays, I'm sure they have those online. But yeah, I remember growing up, I used to read that page every Sunday. Not to mention many other strips, they had a lot of compilation books, and I would either buy those books, borrow those books, or share and trade those books with cousins and friends. Yeah, to be honest, I am not 100% sure where it started, this fascination with comic strips. Of course, the first two series I knew were Garfield and Peanuts. I didn't even know it was called Peanuts back then. I just knew Snoopy and Charlie Brown. But I believe the first comic strip I was formally introduced to was Calvin and Hobbes, the first one that I remember. I was staying at my cousin's, and I think he's a decade older than me, maybe a little more or less. But he had one of those compilation comic books where it's about 128 pages. And comic series, they're typically 6 daily strips and 1 Sunday strip. I don't know how old I was. Maybe I was 4th or 5th grade. I mean, by that point, all you knew was just picture books and chapter books. I mean, at that point, I was still a little bit young for manga. And comics, I thought it was just like Batman, Superman, and all those panels and stuff. Yeah, but Calvin and Hobbes, I just like read through it. And to be honest, it does have a bigger vocabulary at times. Yeah, I whipped out the dictionary pretty often for Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin does not speak like the typical 6-year-old. But it was still fun to follow and relatively easy to understand because you see the different antics that Calvin and Hobbes go through. It's kind of like a sitcom because there are a couple of recurring themes that happen. Not necessarily themes, but I wouldn't call it tropes, such as Hobbes jumping out the door, attacking Calvin when he comes home from school, and Calvin does not like his babysitter, and of course all the things that Calvin can do with snow. And if you haven't really read Calvin and Hobbes, you know that Hobbes is portrayed in 2 different ways. Sometimes he is as a stuffed animal, and sometimes he is a bipedal tall tiger. Yeah, those comic compilation books, they are typically named after a relatively prominent quote from one of those strips. The first one I read was called a Yukon Ho, and then later I got one called Weirdos from Another Planet. That's the thing about Calvin and Hobbes. Some of the stories, they get pretty wild. Like in Yukon Ho, there was a story arc where Calvin, he was literally succeeding from his family. And he wanted to walk up to the Yukon up in northern Canada, and he just packed a couple of sandwiches and grabbed his sled and backpack and walked with Hobbes. And then another story arc, Calvin, he did not want to live on planet Earth anymore because it was too polluted. So he and Hobbes, they ride off the planet in a wagon onto Mars. So they stay on Mars, but then they meet a Martian on there. Then they realize that they should take care of planet Earth first before living on another planet. That's the thing about Calvin and Hobbes. Like the stories, they have quite a bit of imagination, especially with snow and with boxes. And sometimes the comic strip illustrator Bill Watterson, he is pretty reclusive and does not give many interviews, but he shows off his artistic chops, such as that might be a giant tangent of a different storyline going on, whether there's a bunch of dinosaurs or a bunch of aliens doing something, and the last panel is related to Calvin and Hobbes. Sometimes Calvin has alter egos, such as a spaceman Spiff, who has adventures in space, or Tracy Bullet or Tracer Bullet or something like that, where he is a detective. But the thing about Calvin and Hobbes is not just a childhood mischievousness. Sometimes they get pretty philosophical and ask big questions and have commentary about society, but they're not really preaching and not really polarized either. I suppose that it is relatively relatable because Calvin, he may be a 6-year-old kid, but people older than 6-year-old can relate to him, whether elementary, middle, high school, or grown adult. Relatable as in there are bullies and authority figures that you don't get along with. And of course there was Susie, his quote-unquote love interest. But at 6-year-old, it's just like a friends like teasing each other back and forth, And Calvin's parents, they have their own role, as in the mom is the main disciplinarian. Unfortunately, you never really see her in a happy or positive light as often. And Calvin's dad, sometimes he's a bit whimsical and plays tricks on Calvin, or just humors him. And he had a line where certain things just build character. Yeah, Calvin and Hobbes, I believe it only ran for about 10 years. I have the 10-year anniversary book where he gets into detail about the origin of Calvin and Hobbes and the inspiration behind all the characters and all specific strips that thought were kind of prominent or stuck with him. His justification is that Hobbes is not some kind of imaginary friend that turns into life when Calvin's around. But the best way he described it was that Calvin sees Hobbes a certain way and the rest of the world sees Hobbes a different way. Yeah, I believe Bill Watterson once said that Hobbes would be his quote-unquote ideal friend. Someone who listens, but the personality, they kind of bounces off you. They don't completely agree with you, but you're not always at odds with each other. They have their own personalities and own traits. Of course, no friendship or relationship is perfect and everyone's in sync and in tune with each other. But it's like he's there for Calvin, you know? They got emotional moments together. They got many times when they fight, but they play many games together. They make up games together. The good thing is that Calvin, he's usually outside, whether it's riding his wagon or during the winter or riding his sled. Yeah, when I say the box, sometimes he uses the box for transportation, like a time machine, or the one where he used the box to fly to Mars, or a duplicator, or when he made many copies of himself, or a transmogrifier, where he literally just transforms into a different animal, if anything. Calvin is relatable because sometimes he is wisecracking and disobedient and doesn't want to conform to the constraints of daily life and routine. Yeah, he's not a quote-unquote good kid who does his homework and listens to his parents and goes to bed. Yeah, speaking of bed, sometimes Calvin has to deal with the monsters under his bed. And there were a couple of strips when he interacted with aliens too. Yeah, as a kid, I felt bad for Calvin because he usually got in trouble and I felt like no one understood him except Hobbes. But one thing I must say about Calvin and Hobbes is that they taught me many different insults, like a moron, a nincompoop. And you can kind of see the art style and the tone of the comic change over time. Of course, at the beginning, it was relatively flat and more slice of life stuff. But towards the end of the strip, it got more deeper and philosophical. Honestly, many what I call SAT or GRE words. As a matter of fact, I think Calvin and Hobbes was one of the reasons where I started a vocabulary list. Of course, there would be entire dialogues and panels I would read and I wouldn't understand what the heck is he talking about. But as I got older, whether it be high school, undergrad, grad school, I got to see the context behind the higher themes that Calvin and Hobbes talk about. Yeah, I wouldn't say that Calvin was a self-insert for Bill Watterson, or Bill wouldn't want his own kid to be like Calvin. I don't even know if he has any kids, but he said in the 10th anniversary book that Calvin helps him sort through life and reflect upon it in a way. Yeah, they weren't afraid to take on big themes such as loss and death sometimes. Or the one time where the forest where they used to play at, it was beginning to be bulldozed and the trees cut down. Yeah, I said many times that he is relatable, such as procrastination. Like, who in their life has not procrastinated? And Calvin hated waking up early to go to school, or in our case, go to work. And sometimes he gets bored. Sometimes he wants to try something different. Well, fortunately, sometimes his mom is there to stop him before he does those crazy things. Like the one time when he was about to go to school with his pants on his torso and his shirts on his legs, or even naked, believe it or not. And one recurring theme was that Calvin does not like taking a bath. But I guess in that sense, it's relatable to kids and parents. Personally, I was cool with baths, but I know that certain parents, they have trouble giving their kids a bath. Yeah, so it's just all those are recurring sequences and themes that gave the strip the identity. As a matter of fact, the same could be said for most of the strips I'll be talking about. One good thing about Calvin and Hobbes is that Bill Watterson, he actively chose not to license it, so it is strictly a comic strip. There is no official Calvin Hobbes merchandise. There's no Calvin Hobbes TV show. Whenever anyone attempts anything like that, he sends them a cease and desist. But of course, fans cannot help. It's just their way of showing their love and appreciation for the comic strip. Like, I have a Calvin Hobbes bookmark that I bought at a convention. There's been a couple of online strips that chronicle the future of Calvin and Hobbes, though they're kind of like just one-shot Sunday comic panel, such as Calvin grows up and he has a daughter who's kind of afraid, so he gives her Hobbes. Of course, you find Calvin and Hobbes on YouTube sometimes. Two things that stood out was when there was an actual animated video of Calvin and Hobbes dancing to a record being played in the background. There was a comic strip based on that, and they just brought it to life. But of course, those people got a cease and desist. And there was this one YouTube channel that made gritty reboot trailers. So they made a gritty version of Calvin and Hobbes, where as Calvin is growing up, he's beginning to quote-unquote lose Hobbes. Like, he can't see Hobbes as much anymore. Of course, it's not going to be a real movie, but it paid a lot of tribute to the book, such as the monsters under the bed and the snow goons, which are these crazy snowmen that attack them. Yeah, I recommend all the comic strips, and several of them are still being published today. But if there was one standout, I would highly recommend Calvin and Hobbes. Yeah, they made the most with the 10 years they were active as compared to Garfield, which is going on for maybe 40 years by now. And I know Peanuts was at least 50 years. But there's not going to be a reboot. There's not going to be a continuation of Calvin and Hobbes anytime soon. And believe it or not, that's probably for the best. You would want for it to exist solely as a comic strip. Yeah, Bill Watterson even said that he would feel weird if Calvin was like in greeting cards and wishing people good things for certain occasions. Next up is Peanuts. The funny thing is, I did not really read the strips first. We borrowed some videos from the library, and it was usually the holiday specials. I just remembered that Snoopy was very quirky, and I felt bad for Charlie Brown because bad things keep happening to him. And of course, everyone calls him wishy-washy, that he is not very assertive. But I heard that they purposely made him that way, so it kind of reflects like everyday life, that even if things aren't going your way, deep down you are still trying your best. You know that you're a good person, and he'll always have at least Linus and Snoopy on his side, and each of the characters have a specific trait and have a role to play in the comics. Yeah, I've read various Peanut comics strip books over time. They have some that go as old as like the 50s and 60s, though the newest one, it would be slightly before or even in 2000. I remember they made one Harry Potter reference, but it talks about childhood insecurities, but not just childhood, but general insecurities as an adult, if anything. But it's relatively tame and innocent, and unlike Calvin and Hobbes, Peanuts was more licensed, so there's a lot of Peanuts products, not just greeting cards, but stuffed animals, TV specials, movie specials, and so many other merchandise I cannot even count. I literally have at least 2 Peanuts shirts. Of course, the comic strip creator Charles Schulz, he is from the city of Santa Rosa, and there is a Peanuts museum there. I've been there at least 3 times, maybe even 4 times. It was affordable then. I hope it's still affordable, but it is like a tribute, a huge homage to Peanuts, if anything. Like popular, prominent comic strips throughout the entire museum and Schultz's actual office. As a matter of fact, the museum, Schultz did not really live there or write the strips there, but he did everything nearby there. It is also near a ice hockey rink, and Schultz, he also loved to play hockey. And of course, there's Peanuts themes and merch and merchandise there. And if you go into the city of Santa Rosa, there's various statues of Peanuts characters all around. And other places may like Peanuts a lot more than Santa Rosa, or represent it a lot more. I know Japan definitely does. I saw Snoopy and Woodstock and the rest of the characters on so much merch at many various cities. But the thing is, Peanuts and Snoopy, they're universally liked. You can't go wrong with them. They are innocent, they are relatable, there's something for kids, there's something for adults. They have 50 years of strips to pull from. They are not really milking it and not really exploiting the IP. I know that Apple TV made a quote-unquote Snoopy show, which I thought it was fine. It doesn't compare to the charm of the Peanuts strips itself. Of course, Peanuts is a bit easier to comprehend than Calvin and Hobbes. But you can see the long-lasting legacy it had. Because Peanuts, it's American. It captures a sense of America. That there is a soft side, an introspective side, an innocent side, a fun side, a relatable side to it. Of course, when it comes to comic strips, you cannot forget about Garfield. Probably the second most popular comic strip of all time. Of course, nothing beats Peanuts. Yeah, the premise of Garfield is really simple. Fat, orange, tabby cat, lazy with the droopy eyes, loves to eat, hates Mondays, sarcastic and disrespectful towards his owner and Odie the dog. His owner John was initially depicted as a loser, but I think his image improved a little bit over time. And of course, Odie being the silly dog who likes to use his big tongue to lick stuff. Unfortunately, I don't know if Garfield kicks Odie a lot anymore. Well, back then, in the past strips, he did. Garfield also loves to sleep. And he has a stuffed bear named Pookie, and an annoying, cute nephew named Normal. And he had I think she's a love interest named Arlene. Well, what else can you really say about Garfield? That's pretty much the premise of it. Yeah, the thing about most other comic strips, there are about 4 panels at a time. Garfield's typically 3. As a matter of fact, it's been pretty memeified. There was a online website somewhere where it's called Garfield without Garfield. So they literally just take Garfield and his quotes and bubbles out of all the strips. So it's just John talking to himself. So John seems like lonely or have mental problems. Well, as a kid, I liked Garfield. I thought he was funny. Of course, with Garfield, there is a whole bunch of comic book strips. Comic strip books. And they would come in 1 packs and 3 packs. And the 3 packs I would read so often. Yeah, my cousin had a huge Garfield collection and he let us borrow it for a while. And I think we passed those on to my cousins and we borrowed Garfield books from the library. Of course, I didn't really watch the Garfield TV show. Couldn't really relate to it. I watched one of the Garfield movies in theaters, the mid-2000s one with Bill Murray, who voiced Garfield. And I watched the recent animated one too, just out of curiosity, where Garfield was voiced by Chris Pratt. Of course, the first few strips of Garfield, he was fat. He was much fatter. He was more rectangular too. It's kind of like Pikachu, because you watch Pokemon, like Pikachu used to be really fat and then he got skinnier over time. And the same could be said for Garfield. Though the thing is, Garfield was supposed to be fat and lazy, but over time he seemed to get more agile, more willing to move. In the recent animated Garfield movie, he was pretty acrobatic. And the funny thing is, in the Nickelodeon All-Stars Brawl, I guess Garfield is a Nickelodeon character, and he has his own move set. I enjoyed Garfield for a time. As a matter of fact, on the official Garfield website, there used to be this one game called Lasagna from Heaven, which I really liked. The premise of it is very simple. All you have to do is move a mouse back and forth, and it controls Garfield. And you try to eat as much lasagna that falls from the sky. But if you eat a safe or oldie by accident, you get a strike. Yeah, and Garfield was definitely licensed. Lots of merchandise regarding Garfield. We even had a stuffed Garfield at one point. Garfield's pretty popular internationally too, though a bit more in China, in my opinion. The strips I mentioned so far, nothing against Garfield. It's still a good strip and it has its staying power, but you see it for what it is. It's a cash grab. It's a little soulless at times. I heard that behind the Garfield comic strip team, there's about 5 people. And I read the recent strips too. It is not as funny anymore. Some of the jokes feel a bit forced, if anything. It doesn't have the charm and the wit and relatability as the previous aforementioned strips. But it still has its humor. It still has audience. The funny thing is, all these strips, my cousins and I, we grew up reading or trading the books. Yeah, we're quite familiar with all these characters. And especially for Foxtrot. Yeah, so Foxtrot, it's like a family sitcom with the dad Roger, the mom Andy, the older son Peter, the middle sister Paige, and the younger son Jason. Of course, Peter is the jock, Paige is the girly girl, Jason's like the younger nerdy one. He has a pet iguana named Quincy, and Jason likes to annoy Paige. And Peter, he's a little bit of a jock type. Andy, the mom, she's the most sensible one. Roger is a bit quirky. Yeah, the strip just pretty much goes with the family antics and relationships with one another. Yeah, this one addresses pop culture and fandom a bit more. Honestly, I think the strip was an excuse for the creator Bill Ammon to express his geekdom, because he talked about Star Wars a lot, Star Trek a lot, and of course Jason was a supposed nerd, so there were many times where he wrote math equations on the board for Jason. But Foxtrot, it does have heart, and at the end of the day, all the family members, they do care about each other. Not as much merch for Foxtrot. I guess it is not as marketable. And before, a lot of these strips, they have the 6 daily strips and the single Sunday weekly strips. But Foxtrot is strictly down to the weekly strips now. And those are just like the 4 main strips that I grew up with. Some of the other strips, I didn't really have books for them, though a couple I borrow from the library every now and then. But I did read the rest of them in the comics section. Not just the Sunday funnies, but also the daily comics too. Just random names that pop off my head, like Mutz, Pickles, Baldo, Baby Blues, Pearls Before Swine, Get Fuzzy, Luann, a little Dennis the Menace, and Family Circus every now and then. I think of all those strips, the one I did like was a Pearl Before Swine, because the humor got a bit more, I guess, sarcastic, if anything. Yeah, several strips I couldn't really get into or couldn't relate to, like Doonesbury or Dilbert or Kathy. But I'll go on a slight tangent. These comic strips, they briefly inspired me, and I think my cousins too, to briefly create our own comic strips, because most of us read these comics before we read manga. So we understand the concepts of dialogue and speech bubbles and thought bubbles and how many panels to include. Though most of the strips that we created were a bit more serialized, rather than just 3 or 4 daily panel humor strips. I suppose one thing I lament for today's youth is that they did not really have the experience of daily or Sunday comic strips to grow up with. Well, with so much entertainment and stimulation nowadays, even reading the comic strips as collections and books is not as compelling or entertaining, I assume. But regardless, I still recommend it. All these comics, they are likely archived somewhere online. And back then, that's all we had, really. If we needed a break from chapter books, we would read the comics. And we grew up with the characters, we got familiar with all the characters, we found humor in all of the strips, there was a charm to all of them. I even once made a comic strip where there was a self-insert character, and that character was friends with Jason and his friend Marcus from Foxtrot. And in Foxtrot, Jason liked to draw his own comics, so there was a character named Slugman and Leech Boy. So in my comic strip, I would have Jason and Marcus transform into Slugman and Leech Boy, and they have their own powers, and the self-insert character would have his own powers, and they would go on adventures and fight bad guys and stuff. Unfortunately, I lost those comics. But it just expands your horizons, you know? It gives you a little bit of a creativity. Like, this is the character, this is the dialogue, this is a storyline. I guess if you got into more animation and got more serious about it, it could be the onset of storyboarding, if anything. Yeah, but long story short, you're not missing much out on the Garfield comic itself. But I highly recommend that you do read Calvin and Hobbes if you haven't already. There's like a charm, a wit, a humor, a uniqueness to it that I don't know how else to describe. But for all ages, you can relate to it differently at 6, 16, 26. Foxtrot is pretty fun too. You kind of miss the old sitcom days with the family setting. Foxtrot serves as a good substitute, if anything. I don't expect you to read all the Peanuts comics. It's literally 50 years worth of comics. I have a friend and he loves Peanuts a lot, and I think he bought the entire collection. But it'd be nice to know where Snoopy came from and what Woodstock does, and I guess the personalities of Charlie Brown and all of his friends. Yeah, you want to know not just from all the holiday TV specials and whatnot. So you get a bit more in depth in the comics. And they are an easy read, honestly. Well, what can I say? Comic strips. Can't live with them, can't live without them. Well, regardless, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Once again, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye.